Hey everyone, Casella here. A little bit of a rambly one this week, but we do get to the book, I promise. As this episode goes out, I'll be getting ready to head off to California for this year's Worldcon. Hopefully we'll have some fun reporting on that next time. In case you don't make it to the end, a reminder that you can support A Meal of Thorns and the ARB by joining our Patreon, or just by leaving us a nice rating or review wherever you listen. Okay, on to the show. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Brookins. Each episode, we take one book, usually something speculative, sometimes something hard to classify, and we ask a critic, a writer, a scholar, a reader of some kind to walk us through it. Today we are talking about Flore Yegi's The Water Statues, and I am delighted to introduce our guest, Langdon Hickman. Langdon is a critic and writer who looks at literature, metal, and other kinds of music, sometimes games and other media. They're one of the hosts of the extremely good podcast, Death Sentence, and I'm so happy to have them here today. Langdon, how are you?
I am doing pretty well. I have the office to myself today because my wife. It's one of the few days my wife has to go in, and like always, my cat and my dog have kept me fast company. So good stuff.
Yeah, I'm hoping it stays quiet in my office today. So I've recently moved to a different part of Buffalo, where the yards are just big enough that people feel like they need to take care of them a lot.
That sucks.
Yeah, I love some green space, but I don't love the constant lawnmowers and leaf blowers somewhere in the distance. So we'll see what happens. Langdon, you are now the third co-host of Death Sentence that I have captured within one sidereal year on the podcast, enabling me to do the ritual later, but we'll talk about that later.
Excellent.
Before we get into this one, what else have you been reading? Anything cool?
Yes. So I realized the other day, I say the other day, this is like in March, that I'd picked up all of the up-to-date volumes on the calculation of volume.
Cool.
I also had picked up the exact same number of Roberto Bolaño novellas and had the exact number of W.G. Sebald novels left to read to have read his entire body of work. So I gave myself a little structured curriculum of alternating them. And I'm at the very last one there, which is Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald, which is not the one that you hear talked about all the time. Typically when you hear his name, it's The Rings of Saturn that gets brought up, which I think I liked the least of his first three. It's fucking brilliant. So it's it's exactly as good as people say. It's just Austerlitz, though, is pretty clearly his masterwork. It's pretty obvious reading it why he just didn't do a novel after that. He writes a lot of deep history, psychogeographical in a sense, of interlacing what is the mundane, rootsy affect of X area, so Dorchester in England or something like that, and he'll talk about oh, there's a grocer here who has been running a shop for the past 60 years, and I remember coming in here a trip when I was in college, and I picked up some foil wrapped eggs or some. He'll just go off on one like that, and then he'll mention something that happened 1200 years prior to that. And then almost always his books are about him grappling with the Holocaust, specifically as a German who was born in the midst of World War II. He was born in 1942, and so he was raised sort of as a non-Jewish German in the wake of all of that, which is pretty resonant as an American. When you're we did what to the native people? You're yeah, I was beginning to wonder why I don't really see them. So do we just all feel bad about this all the time? And people who have a conscience go, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, it's really strange how even if you're someone who, as a kid, as a child, you pay attention to history, I feel like then there's this whole period of your life, like maybe starting in your teenage years and then continuing for the rest of your life, where you just keep learning all the horrible things that like weren't taught to you and trying to like, how do I fit in here? Like this is where I
Yeah.
am. Like before we started recording, we were talking about the Appalachian Mountains and like growing up as part of this history of displacements. It's also tied to these exploitive practices that directly impact climate change. And like thinking about like how this
Yeah.
all fits together.
It's one of the things that I really treasure about his writing, and why I like bigger, mossier approaches to structuralism within a novel, because they help try to foreground. This actually ties pretty directly to the water statues as well. A foible that I see in a lot of narrative and in critics or readers is a fixation on plot and the demon pacing, where they consider the value of a novel based on the measured dispersal of plot information. And does it move the plot forward? Does it advance those things? Meanwhile, most of my life has been spent contemplating the thing that you just mentioned, which is like any given narrative, if you think of it less like a line and more like a node, it's now connected to all of these other nodes in sometimes ways that feel sidereal at first, but if you follow the chain out, you go, oh, I have a radically different understanding of this thing that I just experienced or that I'm in the throes of. Sometimes it shrinks the thing you're experiencing, and other times you get struck by the kind of awe of like, I can contemplate these, vaster structures of time and superstructures of history, and then like the ache of like losing a friend doesn't get lessened in the wake of that knowledge. And like, how do you, I don't know, I imagine it seems pretty trivial to certain kinds of people, but that question of like, how do these things link together is one of the driving, it's the reason why I do art criticism. It's the reason why I'm also a writer. It's the reason why I read as widely as I do, and do work in philosophy and theory and stuff. It's just sort of like, yeah, if you have the bug, you'll get it. Just hearing someone say that, you'll be like, yeah, man, yeah, what else would you fucking follow? And then I find out there are people who spend their lives mapping out the character relationships in Has Been Hotel, and I think they exist in the same world that carried out the Holocaust and gave birth to go-go music, and where ferns are differentiated from proto-trees. The more incoherent or non-obvious the connection between things are, when you remind yourself that's all in one. Typically it's in one pretty narrow window of history too. We're not even talking about the scale of a universe or something.
Right. Let's see if I can connect this here. So I've been reading a lot of very traditional genre work for a little bit, because I'm trying to catch up on all my Hugo reading, and I'm reading for the there's the Guin Prize. I'm trying to read all those books. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and it was interesting. You bring up Sebald and like thinking about this novel they're talking about today, thinking about the calculation of volume and sort of contrasting those. Is that a thing? I don't want to say that all like traditional big sci-fi fantasy does, but a lot of it does, is the way it thinks about writing and the way it thinks about world building is this sort of fantasy of contained objects that like you've sort of like defined this thing and you can kind of hold it up like a little sphere and contemplate it, and it's all in there.
That is the big element that pulled me toward science fiction and fantasy when I was younger and drove me away from it as I got older, was precisely like, especially if you're younger being a pretty wide range, to be clear. I'm talking like, maybe up to your early 20s. Fantasy and science fiction tends to challenge the narrowness of how you conceive of a life in that window more than other literature that sort of exists for those age groups. Also, thankfully, within the science fiction and fantasy world, outside of sort of the YA wing, and like literally not to comment on that at all, that's its own kind of separate world, there is a big push toward graduation. You find out that some kid likes science fiction. It's not unheard of to be like, yo kid, have you read Dune yet? And someone's like, that kid's 7. Be like, shut up, Dune slaps. This kid's gonna lose his mind. And it's true, like those of us who've been lifers in that kind of space remember reading works that definitely far exceeded our grasp relatively young, because people around us, typically older people also in the space, were like, it's fucking awesome that you're into this. Check this out. But that thrill of like what Ursula K. Le Guin defines as sort of the science fictional mode of like, what is the system explication that's given within a text? What is our relationship to technologies, to history, especially to quote unquote softer technologies of like, history is a social technology. We didn't always write down events, like we had oral tradition and stuff like that. The fact of like, let's record history is a social technology, and that fundamentally shifted how we approach things. You start like getting the fire for that kind of thing, and the traditional world of science fiction and fantasy, and especially sort of the poppier end, can start to feel constrictive after a bit, because like this is the problem as I see it with hard magic in a lot of cases, is they define a set of rules, but the unspoken agreement is that the reader must always be smarter than the text. So, like, you're never allowed to outwit a reader. You're never allowed to satisfactorily surprise them by showing them the rules don't really work the way you think, or we only ever have incomplete models. Instead, there's this kind of infantilizing thing that can happen in the worst of it. Obviously, you guys cover it, we cover it as well. There's plenty of fucking brilliant science fiction fantasies published every year that doesn't do this, and like, fucking thank you to those writers. But so many make it, as you were saying, this like containable, knowable thing. And most of science, philosophy, mathematics, history is about attempting to know the unknowable. And it's just, those are just fundamentally different pursuits.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking a lot about, bringing up Sebald and thinking about Ballet's calculation of volume, which are so much more about being inside something, being inside like a thick, complex substance, right? Instead of like outside it, looking at this little sphere, but like moving through something that you don't totally understand and sort of seeing it from the inside. I just find that kind of fascinating, and it kind of, thinking of it that way, makes me think about those writers who are doing it, even within genre, giving that sense of you don't know everything that's going on, and you won't, because there's so much of it. And tying it back around to that feeling of kind of being in a history that is much bigger than you, and that implicates you, right? That you are in some sense like heir to and complicit in, even though you don't know all of those parts and pieces and facets, and having to uncover them. I don't know, that's kind of fascinating. I at the risk of annoying people, there's a object-oriented ontology thing I really like, which is that because I used to be, when I was a wee baby philosopher, I would get really mad about holism all the time. You know what I mean? I'd get really mad. I was like,
oh yeah,
I think
speaking my language there.
Yeah, there's always I'm fascinated when there are like deeply theoretical splits that people just seem to like instinctively go on one side or the other. And like when I ran into the materialist holism split, I was like, yeah, I'm just a materialist. It's just the way my brain worked. But then later, finding all the speculative materialist weirdos.
Fucking love those guys, by the way. I don't get to talk about them enough on Death Sentence, mostly because a lot of them turned out to be like way too fast adjacent, which is crazy. Like, for any of us that were in the throes of it, that kind of reveal really, really was like a shock, because everyone else was a communist.
Yep. Yeah.
Like that's pretty much it. There was no middle. And so you just kind of look around and you go like, wait, Nick Land was not doing a bit?
The long shadow of the CCRU reappears. But there's this but there was this line in, I don't know if this was a Harman or a Morton line, but talking about how they think about objects and their relation to each other, and they were talking about holism versus, reductivism. But they had this really weird take that the more I think about, the more I think is true, and it kind of makes me mad, which is that, make sure I say this right. So it's not that wholes are more than the sum of their parts. It is that wholes are actually less than the sum of their parts. That's where the disjunct is, because all of the parts wind up being more complex the more you look at them. So there's this way that looking at a whole is always an act of reduction, right? Like the whole is a construct that is simpler than the things it is made of. So it's actually less, which it flips the holism thing on its head. And I kind of like that.
There's a math equivalent of this, which is going to be, if we haven't lost people yet, let's fucking lose
them now.
Which is the same thing, looking at sets within math, like literally any given set. The minute that you've reduced, for those who aren't math people, a set is a group of elements. The end. If that sounds open-ended, it's deliberately open-ended. So you can literally put anything into a set, and boom, that's a set. But so if you have like 10 abstract things in this set, and you give that set a name, typically our brain does this like info bunching thing that we've studied a great deal in neuroscience, where we start thinking about them as a single unit. And like Derrida looked at this a lot with his writing about the logos. Like, we reduce it to the name, and we do logical operations on the name. At a certain point, we stop thinking about what is in the name. To your point about it being naturally less, this sort of mathematically pans out. If you think of it as just a set of 10 things, it's easy to go, okay. The amount of interrelations between 10 things is 10 factorial.
Right.
It's 10 times 9 times 8 times 7, blah, 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 blah. And that's the same for no matter how many elements you have, it's that factorial is the number of connections and interrelations there. And rarely when we think about the whole, do we think about all of the interrelations, from none of them at all to all of them interconnected, to every pairing, to every trio. Especially if you think of, like, does the order matter? Because suddenly if the order matters, you get an even bigger number. Science fiction and my love of math kind of drove this into my head, the more that it was like, are there books that follow that rabbit hole? That's why, like, I haven't read Greg Egan yet, mostly because I keep spying him, and I'm like, I'm going to have too much fun, I bet.
I was just about to mention Egan, I think. Yeah,
I was like,
yeah.
Someone was like, he puts equations in his books, and I was like, fuck, I love that. Like,
he has a novella where, this is a spoiler, but they're all inside an artificial construct that is moving close enough to a black hole that the relativistic effects have like cultural tack-ons, and he like worked out what they would be like, and it like plays in. Anyways, he does that kind of stuff all the time.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That is stuff that I love, of like, again, treating it as a playground of fiction of ideas. Because, like, at a certain point, you're like, how many fucking times can I read about, like, can people have sex with an alien? Yes, you can. We've mapped that territory. Or it's like, is the elf happy or is the elf sad? The elf is always mournful. They're melancholic. It's a melancholic race. We know this answer.
I get why it's like this, but I also get kind of bummed sometimes that within the arts, it is a conversation, right? It's this big, beautiful, multi-woven fabric through all human history, blah, blah, blah. But that, like, every once in a while, it feels like someone should be able to be like, okay, we're done talking about this.
Right.
And you can never really do that, right? Like, I thought about like that. I remember like the first time I read Watchmen, I was like, oh, cool. So they stopped making comic books after this, right? Like, right? Like, that's like, we've said the last word on this. We can do something else now, right? When I read Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, I'm like, oh, cool. Like, we're done doing generation ship novels now, right? But it doesn't, and I get why. But sometimes it frustrates me.
It's one of the things that the genre space gets touchy about, which there's this mutual antagonism between literary and genre spaces, which I find absolutely fucking hysterical as someone who likes both, because they're both built out of these radical misapprehensions about what the other one is saying. But the thought of like, oh, well, literary fiction is a genre too, and they get mad at us for it. And it's like, yeah, but like, if you can automatically reduce your book to like, what if a generation ship had blank? As a writer, does not that frustrate you? Like, don't you want there to be like more toothsomeness or more, especially given in science fiction or fantasy, nominally you've given yourself the widest possible conceptual palette.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why are we following so many preordained lanes?
Yeah.
Granted, then every year we get people who blow that notion out of the water, which is...
There's something interesting about how reducibility is so tied to commercialization, basically, right? Like,
yeah,
you got to have the elevator pitch, or what do you do? But to transition us, let's talk about a book that is very hard to do an elevator pitch for.
Oh, yeah.
Very hard to reduce to a line or two. Today we're talking about Water Statues by Flor Yeghi. This was originally published in 1980 in Italian by Adelphi, and it's one of her early novels. We're reading the English translation by Gina Alhadeff, which is published by New Directions. It's a very short work. It is very hard to describe. It's a series of connected scenes, monologues, and conversations that are loosely anchored on this character called Beeklam, who's an eccentric collector of statuary that he keeps in a half-submerged basement in Amsterdam. It's not always clear who's talking or when or to whom, but there are strange and intense sets of imagery and emotions that come through, and there's this presence or status of the statues all throughout that's sort of an uncanny framing, and we sort of like slowly piece together this family and connected characters, and those are the people we're kind of working with. Very strange novel, very interesting. But Langdon, tell me why this book.
So, I encountered this book by pure chance. It was one of those instances where another writer and critic that I know was talking about it, and technically was giving a negative review, but did their job well enough in terms of describing what the text was and its function that I went, oh no, that sounds great to me. A guy named Jayaprakash Satyamurthy. I probably pronounced the name incorrectly because, like...
Oh wait, from is that from Gin and Miskatonic?
Yes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, no, he's a brilliant fucking guy.
Yeah.
Fantastic writer. He had mentioned it and talked about it being... I don't want to put words in his mouth because I don't remember exactly what it was, but basically like a bit too spare and skeletal that like it's hard not to be impressed by the language, but it's also hard to know what even you read. And for me, I'm like I'm a big nut for like M.R. James ass ambiguity. I was like, oh shit.
Put that as like a blurb on the cover, like impossible to tell what's happening, but the sentences are really beautiful. Like, yeah.
Like I bought the Eugene Thacker book, An Ideal for Living, because I was like, what do you mean it's a novel where you get the concept, but you can't really read it because it's not written in sentences? What do you mean? Yeah, I picked it up, and it was around the same time, by pure happenstance, that I had just gotten and read Piranesi. Like, total fluke. I'm maybe the only person who's ambivalent about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I looked at it and I was like, I read it. I'm like, I get why people are inflamed over this. I read enough stuff that's already in that mode that like, oh, but she's doing it well. I'm like, well, yeah, you can do it well. So I never thought to pick up Piranesi right when it came out. Long story short, like everyone, I was blown the fuck away by that book. Yeah, the fact that I ran into this immediately in the wake felt too serendipitous.
Yeah.
Like, the only kind of woo I let myself get into is the sort of chasing synchronicity and serendipity, where it's purely perspectivist rather than like metaphysical. But I was like, the stars have aligned, bitch. We got to read Flor Yeghi. We going to Switzerland. To say that it blew my socks off doesn't capture it. I normally read relatively slow compared to what I think a lot of people imagine a literary type does. I read as much as a writer as a critic. And so there's a lot of like, you know, what are they doing on this sentence level? Like, how are they pivoting here and wanting to have that, you know, under my fingers? I blew through this in a day. Like, within 24 hours, I was completely done, and I walked over to my wife, staggered as though someone had hit me with a blackjack, and said, you have to read this, like, right away, because it's genuinely perfect. Like, every character, every bit of punctuation, every space, every empty space left, it's perfect. It's like a little perfect crystal. And like any other writer would have embedded that crystal in something. They would have fleshed it out. But this reads very much like someone took an existing book and carved away everything except the most necessary vignette snatches of dialogue, interactions, and just compiled them. On both ends, like the concept and the narrative craft end, it constantly flabbergasts me that more people don't talk about this, especially in genre space, because there's a kind of the epilogue flips the novel on its head in terms of conceptually what you encounter, in a way that's like it just slides it perfectly into the hand of the genre writing world. It just contains to say it contains no pulp elements is like way underselling it.
Yeah. I mean, if you approach this as someone who reads a lot of genre fiction, weird fiction, surrealism, I think you're kind of primed for it.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting to think that like you could come at it without that and not walk away having picked up on any of those readings because it's so ambiguous, which is one of the things I like so much about it. The way that the condition of narration shifts through this is something that's kind of mind-boggling, and I think goes back to that feeling of it being sort of carved out of something else. I don't know if that's actually how the author approached it. There's a really skilled, really craft-skilled level to Yegi's ability in this novel to get at something really precise in a character or emotion or a scene, in how someone's face looks, in how someone's hands feel coming out of their sleeves, all these odd little things, but they don't feel like they are floating detached. These aren't like a collection of notes that have put together. They do feel like they've sort of been abstracted off something final.
Yeah. Like you can sense there's an implication of a structure. You aren't given you're given these little glimpses of it in a way that, like, it is hard not to believe in your heart of hearts that there is an underpinning structure that just has mostly been obscured, like in a wild literalization of the Hemingway iceberg thing.
Yeah.
It also plays out in a way that I forget what it's called in dramaturgy, where it's like lighted box theater or something, where the light comes on and you get a snatch of a scene and then the light goes off. When the light comes on, you get a snatch of a scene and then the light goes off. Instead of it being this long, discursive, highly diegetic experience, you also get dialogue that feels like it's been abstracted. And like a critique that I'd seen is that no one in this book talks like a person, which is true, but that's because I think you also, the tie between something like this and the work of Lydia Davis also feels extremely pressing, where you kind of have to train your brain to read it poetically rather than prosaically. And so, like, with a poem, you'll get a snatch of lines and you'll sort of meditate on them and you'll let this lateral motion happen in your head. And for prose, we're trained often not to do that, to be like, but what is on the page? And she very clearly wants you to, slide off the edge.
It has, for me, a very strong theatrical feel. Not in the sense of like being like a contained traditional stage play, but going back to the idea, like, right, the light box, like that you're just hearing these voices. They're very, very fleshed out voices in a way that's maybe like a little Beckett-y, maybe.
Yeah. There's a huge amount of Beckett in this. Now, I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned it, but I'm like,
it's true that the idea that they don't talk like people, like, on the one hand, I see that on the one hand. The other thing is that all of the characters who speak here are themselves poetic and capable of like really beautiful language, right? Incisive, strange. They feel very intelligent. They also feel very isolated. This feels like a book that is, on the one hand, deeply about grief and deeply about isolation, and having a lot of conflicted feelings about bridging that, basically, right? There are all these moments of connection or almost connection that are kind of colored by disgust in like a really interesting way. And there's that recurring thing, where is I put it again? It says there's a recurring feeling of sort of like a libidinal energy that is violent and like trying to figure out what to do with that. This feeling of someone who's like intensely alone and wants to connect and can sort of only conceive of that kind of negatively, even though it's still wanted. There's one or two points where it says, what's it say? It says, in helping another, a friend, there is a vague homicidal passion that's hard to corral into a less murderous sentiment. And there's a couple other points where different characters sort of talk about this like weird line between friendship and actually feeling like homicidal towards someone, like in the same space.
This is an aspect that I wish more people from genre space knew about the world of like literary fiction. Because because the juxtapositional elements are pulp versus literature, not genre versus that's a ludicrous kind of, especially because the more literary stuff you read, the more you're like, oh, none of those people look down their nose at genre at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they all grew up loving the same stuff. They reference it, they interpolate it. There's a very like I would describe that element of this text that's like perniciously European, especially the post. When I say postmodernist, I mean literally like from the 1920s on, from the modernists forward. In European literature, there was this turn toward analyzing not just the beauty a person contains, but like what is the hidden ugliness in things as somehow being more intimate. This comes in the wake of a whole bunch of things. Like there was the whole decadent and aesthetic movement, which folk privileged like beauty over everything. Like they preferred artificiality over the organic, because the feeling that you can perfect the artificial, you can't perfect the organic, it just is. In the wake of the psychotic anti-human violence of World War I, which then was only deepened after World War II, and the sort of mass confrontation with crimes against humanity, that like people knew, but the reality that most people had a way to connect, like, what are you doing in the Congo to provide this wealth for Antwerp, was made completely untenable after the journalistic reveals in the wake of World War II. It just was like, oh, this is the world that we've been part of. And it mirrors, like, all these tales of, like, you believe the distant aristocrat, you believe you're getting this intimate view when you learn about how nice and congenial they are, but how much more intimate is it when you learn about the kind of icy cruelty that they carry against only lovers and family members.
Mm.
And that kind of thing of, like, trying to peer as deep as possible into someone, which this is wrapped up so much in both that mindset as well as clearly a kind of PTSD rattled psyche. To psychoanalyze a little bit of the narrative voice rather than the narrators, it has that same dissociative, highly paranoid affect that you get from just a lot of unprocessed PTSD, where the sense of like the threat signals in your brain are constantly going off, and so there's this constant need. What is reassuring is locating threat, not locating comfort, because comfort just means you haven't discovered the threat vector yet. This carries most of the way through the main text. The epilogue, again, radically flips that to a point where it feels like it explains why exactly the book you read was so menacing and skeletal and like sparse, like a leafless tree. To touch quickly on the epilogue so it's less ambiguous, the epilogue takes the character of Katrine, who before was like the human amongst this world. The two primary characters outside of her are Lampe, who seems like a groundskeeper or like tends the house. We have Bikram, who collects the statues and is otherwise like a mask of ice. And then Victor, who I'm not sure how I would place him within the dynamic of the house, but it's those three, and it's this like really cryptic thing. And then Katrine is this human interlocutor. And then it's revealed in the epilogue that she's outside of the house staring at it, ruminating on how the three people who live there hung themselves, and this contemplation of like the house looking like it's always on the verge of catching fire and burning down, that suddenly is like, I was reading a ghost story.
Maybe. Right.
Like,
yeah. And there's all these, so like if you're reading this from the perspective of like you're trying to piece together what works, right? It opens with a dramatis personae, right? Tells you who these people are.
Oh, there's also Caspar. I forgot about you,
Yeah,
Caspar.
Caspar and Katrin have like maybe a father abandoned daughter relationship. It's not super clear. But so like when you're reading this at first, what I was trying to do was piece together, okay, these are these sort of like family members. How do they relate to each other? But the narration is so variable. It's not always clear who's speaking or in what time frame they're speaking, right? So you have at least 2, maybe 3 generations that are all dealing with different kinds of grief and separation. And then the added thing of that, and this is like the uncanny element, this is like candy for me, is the statues being either named after people or maybe just those people were statues the whole time. Right, and so we have Thelma, and we have a few other characters,
like
who
Rosalind and
and then there are human people who at times a narrator describes them as having chipped features. Like suddenly it seems as like actually maybe they've been describing someone made of stone. And of course, our quote unquote main character talks about the statues moving around, right, in the water in this way that it's not clear if it's literally just the water moving them around, if it's just a visual thing, or if they're actually like moving around.
It, like, the way that it takes this, it's funny because it's a poeticized image that has been referenced in film to the point where it's like practically satirical if you do it now. It's hard to do in a sincere way, of like what looks like a diagonal shot of the shifting of water and how it will make a stationary figure look like they're swimming.
Mm-hmm.
And how this often gets used to denote like mental perturbation, that, you know, you have the reflection of a woman and then the water shifting, but she's actually still, and you go, okay, yeah, man, I get it. Yeah.
My favorite one, just to interject real quick here, is apparently on the set of Blade Runner, somebody in the scene at the what is it, the headquarters, I can't remember the name of the company, but and apparently like Harrison Ford asked like, where is his light coming from? Because there's like the weird like light, and Ridley Scott was like, from the lights, man. Like, because like there's no pool of water in the scene, but there's like reflected water like going over them. Anyways, continue. I just love that. Yeah,
it's wild within the book because anytime you feel like you've settled on one diegetic explanation, she'll pivot, and like that's an element mechanically of writing the uncanny that I think people mistake as being unique to it, rather than being, this is what happens when you take seriously the task of the poet and apply it to prose.
Yeah.
Because the task of the poet is to convey the heart of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Literally everything is just about how do I explicate the heart of it. Like, what firm details, what details do I elide, which ones do I combine, which ones do I explode outward, which ones do I leave granular, what do I do with the line? All of that's like, you're conveying a thing that isn't just the text. The text is a means to get to this external thing. And a lot of people who are prose readers are used to, I am given literal information that is correct or incorrect. And what is important is to know what is correct and know the relations of these correct things. And so this being a book that the emotionality of it is far from opaque.
Yeah.
You know what she is saying as you're reading it. You feel it. When you talk about the book, it's hard not to talk about this, like, the way that it's melancholic in a quiet, withdrawn way, and that like every attempt for it to open its mouth and explain its melancholy becomes these like twisted brambles of words, and that like anyone who's dealt with really severe like melancholy is distinct from depression, this thing of like, how come I don't feel human within the world, and I see humanity within the world, but I don't see myself in that humanity, and I don't feel that I am connected by that or to that. That's present on every single page. The open-ended question of, are the people statues or are they people and there are statues? Are the statues real. Because you get that, like, it's already a cryptic image that they're kept in a half-flooded basement. That, like, it feels like that can't be literally true. And the way that, like, especially looking at how marble plays with water, having like, marble kind of looks like water captured mid-slosh and then rendered into stone. So it's like, okay, she's clearly playing with something there. The cover, this is an instance of fucking great design. The cover gives an instant sort of emotional clue. It's blue as fuck. So we're like, okay, I know the emotional color to go in here. And it looks like the bare framing of a human face with a tear. But then if you look over it even more, there are other water drops in places that could not possibly be tears. And so, like...
Also that it's this, presumably an image from a statue.
Yeah.
That doesn't have the sort of micro-expressions of crying. So you're getting these sort of, like, conflicting feelings about what the emotion is in it.
It's one of those things where, like, you can tear yourself to pieces pondering the exact connections between things. And I think that's exactly where you would lose the novel rather than gain it. Like, you wind up trying to chase this rabbit hole of knowability rather than witnessing the feeling of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something from a craft level that's tremendously beautiful to me about a text that tells people who read that way, no, you don't even get a coherent book. In a lot of other cases, we'll wind up seeing people, be they critics or readers, talk about any given text, and they'll talk about basically their reaction to plot holes, or, like, you know, why did they do X instead of Y, like, and kind of missing, like, what emotion or experience what must have been within the writer that they go, I have to spend months capturing and refining this feeling, and it can only be this shape. That's also where it's kind of frustrating whenever I see critical approaches that basically go, so the author structured their own book wrong. Did they, or are you not apprehending what they were trying to do? Which they still may have failed at, but, like, asking yourself, what if this is necessary, and I don't get what is necessary about it?
I was thinking a lot about negative capability through this, and thinking about, you know, that Keats line, I think it's in one of the letters, about a poet being the most unpoetical of things, right? That, like,
Yeah.
a poet is not a good subject of poetry because you sort of, like, make yourself into a lens that other things move through you.
Yes.
And, like, I feel that very strongly here, but at the same time, that's not quite right because that lens has such a definite sort of filter on it here, that's sort of coloring or shading everything that you see with this extremely precise kind of, like, emotional shading, I guess, to what's going on in it.
I mean, this actually hits at another thing that I think literature is broadly more accepting of, and genre struggles with. There are times where, like, if I say, have you read X Philip K. Dick novel, and it's one you've never heard of, you have a sense of the feeling of that novel. Even before I mention a single thing, you're like, Philip K. Dick feels a certain way. Ursula K. Le Guin feels a certain way. But in so many other cases, the critical discussions amongst lay readers and amongst critics kind of try to push that element away, that books aren't a thing that you feel, and that you know through non-scientific means, you know through the emotionality of a text what its directional vector is, how it wants to unfurl. It's something that you know in a very mechanized, you know, here's what's written down. In fact, it's considered almost like a sin to have a prosaic voice.
Yeah.
That, like, voice gets in the way of the text, which is what you're supposed to be giving me. This runs completely counter to that. To your point, it feels like I'm reading Flor Yagi writing these topics. Like, you get this sense of a personhood beyond the pen, not just the text itself. And what's funny is, just like with great poetry, you get that as well. And like with great poetry, to my understanding, she was not anything like this text would imply reading it. Like, even that supposed connection is a deliberately crafted one, that it's like, I'm going to give an invocation of a character that you're going to assign my name that isn't actually me, and I'm going to wield even that shadow to be a little bit on the nose. Like, that looms as a statue itself over the... Oh, that's beautiful.
There's a thing that I really, really, really cherish in writing and literature, particularly in novels and prose, that's kind of hard to talk about without sounding kind of woo, which is, and it kind of goes back to like the kind of like psychogeography, the fact that like places they got vibes, you know what I mean? Like spaces, whether they're, a constructed environment, whether they're inside, whether they're a room, whether they're outside, they're a natural landscape, they have feelings, and like part of that is in the narrator or the viewer, but part of that is there's something creepy about this room. There's something, they have like these very specific flavors, and the ability to do that and to get that across is something I really love when people can do it. And I'm thinking a lot of like Sofia Samatar does a great job of thinking about atmosphere, and she might not be telling you the history of colonial violence and like religious changes that like suffuse this scene, but she is telling you about like the colors of the walls and what that emotion is being conveyed, and a way of like trying to capture that somehow. And this book, even though like I'm not even sure like where they're all set, like which scene, where is this happening, it does such a great job of capturing that kind of like psychic energy to the surroundings, to the backdrops, and it makes that so present. And so that's where, even though like a lot of this does feel kind of monologue-y, it kind of feels like that voice in the darkness, but it is always like in a place and about a place at the same time.
I mean, this is one of the things that I get into discussions with other critics about a lot, especially ones that are like of the Marxist and materialist bent, like me, when it comes to like political subject matter, is that literature is fascinating because it's the thing that justifies why things like psychoanalysis and religion exist. And not meaning that in a derogatory way towards either of those. It's that as someone who thinks like in a philosophical sense, psychoanalysis falls flat for a huge number of reasons, it is, if anything, a journalistic record of how a mind experiences things in the language of how does the experience feel. Like, we may use better philosophical language to go like, what is happening within the brain during experience? How does it interlink with things? How do we extrapolate knowability versus non-knowability? But this question of like, when you leave a dream, you know for this flash of a second before it's gone what the dream means, even if you were to say all of what happened and it's clearly fucking nonsense from a normal vantage point. And that's something that more traditionally science-minded minds really struggle with, is if you were to really drill into them and ask them, how does poeticism work? Mechanically, how does this happen? They would struggle to define that, even if they're moved by poetry, and it's largely because it follows those hazier lines, because that's the map of the psyche, not of the brain. The psyche is the thing that we experience from within the psyche. And like, the fact that it doesn't really exist outside of that doesn't change the fact that we are experientially bound within it. And so if you try to tell someone like that most of science and math, which is wonderful and very necessary to be clear, is an attempt to go, let's get rid of as much of that as we can to apprehend things as they are. Poetry, and through that literature and all these other spaces, are ways of mapping that interior. I mean, this is where when it clicks in your head how hokey, delightfully hokey to be clear, but the title of Cloud Atlas is he's talking about a mind and memory, is you're trying to make an atlas of shifting clouds, and you're like, oh, damn, David, you've spent hundreds of pages baiting me into a bad pun. You got my ass. But yeah, this lives in that same kind of space where, again, if you approach it with that sort of mind of poeticism, let me phrase it a different way. The sort of classic poem of, as creatures slouching toward Bethlehem, waiting to be born, widening gyre, all that, the second coming. You know how that feels well before you study poetry. Like, when you're a kid and you encounter that somewhere, it gives this, like, prophetic, luminous feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that you learn about it explicates where is this feeling coming from within this text. But you feel it immediately. Even though, if you try to tie it to, like, is it something about gyres that feels quite numinous? And you're like, no, I don't know what a gyre is. And so it's like, it's anything that spins. And you're like, oh, huh. And it's like, is it falcons then?
Right.
Are falcons numinous? And you're like, it breaks apart on the atomic level. That's the sort of the alchemical function of art. That, like, it isn't chemistry because you can't break it down scientifically. I mean, Borges looks into this in Pierre Menard, author of the Quixote. The notion of, like, if you were to erase Don Quixote from history, and someone from South America who doesn't speak 13th century Catalan Spanish were to write exactly Don Quixote in the exact language that Miguel Cervantes used, character by character, in the 1960s, that's a totally different book. Like, the way that you would approach, like, how did a 16-year-old who doesn't know this dialect make this book, which so richly depicts that time period, versus someone who is in it? The version of it that doesn't give birth to hundreds of years of legacies of literature versus the one that did. The text is exactly the same, but the alchemy surrounding it that you can't get rid of is altered to such a degree that, like, you don't read it the same way.
What's the Hillary Putnam line that meanings aren't entirely in the head, right? Like, there are meanings outside the head too.
That's one of the reasons why, like, genuinely this book is perfect in my mind.
It's also just, I mean, we've talked so much about its sort of poetic structure, and it, like, I hate to use the word prose poem because it just drives me nuts for some reason, but it kind of is.
Yeah.
Like, it's all these little, like, 1-page, 2-page kind of sections that are broken up very distinctly.
There are chapters, but it's unclear why precisely the chapter structure exists in addition to the scene structure.
There's something about the mix of the extremely ambiguous sort of setting and superstructure, the very concrete actual language that you're reading, and then some of the sort of very unusual and very, again, sort of like vibe expressing metaphors that Yegi uses throughout this. There's a point where a character says that water is a burnt body, that's a very strange, like, that's not a metaphor that springs to mind for water, right?
Right. She refers to a house as slumbering gold.
Yeah. There's a point where there's just a scene being described that's sort of like this nice little patio, like under a tree, and it says the placid talons of the leaves. And, like, that conjunction, like, to think of the shadows as talons immediately gives this scene, right, one kind of reading, but they're placid talons. That's just all through this. Even to I love the last line before the epilogue. It's the sundial goes on marking time with its small angular shadow, black and slithery on the tepid stone. That's the good stuff.
Right.
And it's all through this. And, like, again, like, her ability to capture really odd, surprising insights into human emotion through, like, the human face and the human body with these sort of, like, really short, incisive one-liners all throughout. Really startling. I was thinking a little bit, I don't know, have you happened to read any Dune Arbus novelist wrote The Caretaker?
I haven't. I'm going to look that up.
Yeah.
Right away.
I want to say that's also a New Directions book, but had reminded me of that a bit in its thinking about material stuff and material objects, not as like not as a shorthand to thinking about personality, but just as like, no, this is personality. Like, the extended world around you is also the stuff of personhood, and that kind of comes back around to, like, this book's very strange subliminal or aquatic connections to Piranesi, which is such a different book, right? I mean,
yeah,
so different. But if you read them in any kind of conjunction, they feel like they're shouting over the wall at each other.
I feel like reading Piranesi immediately prior to this primed me for it in a very specific way. Because, one, it's hard to read this and look at the time that it was published and look at Susanna Clarke's age and not go, you had to have read this. There is no way that you happened into a near identical conceit. Great, she does a radically different thing with it in terms of prose direction, but then even in a lot of the structure, like the early half of Piranesi structurally lives very close to this, where it's the scattered journals of the main character. The fact that she takes it and makes it the Platonic realm of ideas, that it's like a literalization of Plato's heaven, with the levels representing closeness to the unconsciousness versus closeness to the numinous, and you only get the statues in this middle window where it hasn't sunk into the water of the subconscious mind and hasn't risen into the clouds of, of the lordly. That feels as much like a decoder ring for this text as this text feels like a poetic decoder ring for Piranesi. And, like, granted, neither one of them need each other. But Piranesi's another genuinely perfect novella. There's not a single scene that I think you could add or take away that would improve it. But yeah, the way that they feel quite paired with each other, because Susanna Clarke demonstrates this understanding of, like, what are the statues? What is their abstracted forms, and leaning really into that and going, like, what does it mean that you're filled with a gallery of these dead, frozen, abstracted forms and no connection with their living counterpart? And what kind of tenderness do you have to acquire that? But what kind of coldness do you have to have that this is what you've acquired and not the relations themselves? Like, versus Floriegi kind of just placing you in there. Like, the narrative voice itself, this is a thing that, side note that is very much related. When people refer to books as having gimmicks and they're a critic, that's when I know that I can disregard their future work entirely. Because it's like, no, the word you wanted was conceit, and that you didn't like the conceit. Because it turns out structures aren't gimmicks. You just are or are not used to a structure, and that's fine. In a lot of cases, we can challenge, what does a certain structure give or take away? Does it satisfactorily achieve either the way that other people talk about its relationship to the text, or is it just kind of there? Like, I can follow the notion of calling it a gimmick if it feels like the text pre-existed the structure, and the structure is just kind of a way to attempt to punch up interest, but doesn't meaningfully interweave.
You're really, David Mitchell's really catching strays here. I can hear it.
Well, no, I actually, no,
No, that's me throwing it that way. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Yeah, I was like, I like when a lot of people will use what other people wind up terming a gimmick, because it's like, okay, you're thinking about the structure of your novel as well. It's because that's another thing of, like, you find weaker and weaker readers who believe they're getting stronger and stronger when they go, I want every book to have the same structure. It approaches narrative voice the same way. It approaches dialogue voice the same way. It approaches description and explication the same way. It approaches exposition the same way. It structures its scenes the same way, structures its chapters. It's, at that point, you're like, you just want data.
Yeah.
You want a Wikipedia article about a book. You don't want a book.
Well, I think this goes way back to that, talking about Sebald, talking about calculation of volume and sort of like being inside something instead of having it outside. And that stories are fine, but stories are a bad way to approach literature as like the be all end all of what's happening in them, right? Because stories are reducible, and stories do reduce, like plots do reduce. There's no more information under it once you've sort of boiled it down to the plot. And it's all that other stuff that we're interested in. So when you get a book like this that literally does not have a story or a plot that you can find, all of those other features are sort of like what you have to grapple with.
And it reveals really quickly whether someone is familiar with reading structurally. And this is not meant as a knock to to people who aren't. We genuinely do a bad job teaching how to do that until, like, it really wasn't until college and graduate level poetry classes, most specifically, but somewhat in prose as well, that I really had broken down for me by someone. Here's how you read the structure of a work and not just the words.
Mm-hmm. And I think like that's on a way that's almost like a sort of parallel to that idea of the feeling of land, the feeling of rooms, the atmosphere of a place. Like the idea that like the book has a thing that is the book in entire, that is not the plot, that is not like I can just diagram this little thing, but that the book as a whole has a structure that's not just the, what are they called, the chronotypes, you know, like there's more to it than that. It's all the things it's doing. Speaking of losing structure, my little timer that warns me that I'm going to collapse from heat exhaustion in the closet just went off. So Langdon, thank you so much for bringing this book to my attention, hopefully to readers' attention. I hope people pick this up.
Yeah, it's especially for people who like experimental prose because they like going, what else can it do? Or horror readers in general. I think most horror readers are attuned pretty well to the sensitivity you need to read something like this, where it reads like the diary of a ghost.
We didn't talk about that angle much at all, but it has such like a, I don't know, this is like a case study in like a very particular kind of dread / haunting.
Testament to the fact that it is less than 100 pages. We've been talking about it for nearly 2 hours, and we are stopping because of a timer, not because we're out of stuff to say.
How unnatural and structured of me. Langdon, where else can people find you? What do you want to hype?
So I am one of the co-hosts of Death Sentence, which the rest of my co-hosts have been on here. We do literature, Marxism, heavy metal, but we've covered all sorts of kinds of stuff. It's much more driven by the conversation and voice of the participants rather than necessarily what we're looking at. So I'm wildly proud of that. Been doing that for a number of years. I write for Treblezine, where I do regular reviews of contemporary music, and also I have a column there called I'm Listening to Progressive Rock, where I talk about a very wide range of progressive music, like from modern experimental hardcore bands to like classic Yes clones and weird obscure deep cut bands and all kinds of shit. I also am a writer at Consequence of Sound, doing mostly heavy music journalism, which is the less interesting part, but I also do the heavy song of the week and mining metal, which mining metal specifically covers underground heavy metal records, and we wind up recommending 96 a year through that, so it's lots and lots of stuff. And then on top of that, I have a newsletter and I write novels and all kinds of shit. Thank God it appears on Google if you type my name in.
Well, Langdon, thank you so much. This book was a blast. I'm really glad it got put in front of me. This podcast is really just a very long-form experiment in getting people to get me to read really cool stuff that I wouldn't have got to otherwise, so thank you.
Hell yes.
Thanks, man. Have a good one.
Of course, you too.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartra Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabrielle Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. You can support A Meal of Thorns and the ARB by joining our Patreon, by buying books through our bookshop links, and by leaving us a rating or review wherever you listen. You can drop us a line at mealofthorns@gmail.com and follow us on Blue Sky if you're into that. Coming up next, I'll be bringing you a bit of a WorldCon report, hopefully with some good conversations, good coffee in there. After that, fear not, back to books. Garrett Bridger Gilmore returns to talk about Pauline Hopkins' 1903 novel Of One Blood, a genre mashup with a lot of thoughts about racial politics. After that, Rosanna Pendlebury and I are talking about the Le Guin Fiction Prize shortlist, and there's more good stuff on the way. Thanks for listening. Check the website if you want to read ahead, and as always, stay critical out there.